A special hello to you, students. I am David Pearson. I'm sorry you're unable to see my face on this recording because my video camera has stopped working just suddenly. But I need to put this video together just because we are unable to meet with each other given circumstances beyond our control. So this is our first time together, and I'm asking that you go through this video to the end, and having gone through to the end, that you will go to the questions at the very end of the document to see if you can follow through on them. Okay, so here goes. Well, let me just introduce myself to you. I'm David Pearson. I've been involved in theological education for 40 years, actually teaching for 36 years in theological education, and it is this my second stint teaching at Midlands in the day school. I teach also online in the lay leaders program. It's great to be with you, and I'll get a chance to meet with you sometime during the semester. Hopefully, that will be so very soon. But this is for our first lecture, and this is I'm calling it the Gospels, a beginning discussion. I want to mention that this is a beginning discussion. This is not the be all and end all of that we can say about these issues, but they are important to get you started as a student. You can go on, and I hope that you will go and do your own reading and your own reflection as we move forward to get a better picture of what's happening. So let's go. So I want to start out by talking about what we're attempting to do today in this video. First of all, by the end of the session, I'm hoping that students should be able to define the term gospel. We'll talk a little bit about that shortly. We're going to give a basic explanation of the synoptic problem, what that is, you're going to see, and also describe the major elements of the world of the New Testament, which are fundamental for understanding of the Gospels and the book of Acts, frankly speaking, for the entire New Testament. Now, once we do that, then if you look at the course objectives on your course outline, you will see that there are some other things we want you to accomplish from this unit. For instance, I want you to be able to analyze the contents of the four canonical gospels separately, and you want to be able to explain the similarities and differences. Much of that we can't do in this lecture, even though what I will do is give you some hints as to the way forward. And then as you do your own reading and your own thinking, then I'm hoping that you'll be able to do this a little bit more. Okay? I hope. If you have any trouble with that in what I just said, you can send me a WhatsApp message using the number on the course out. But let's move forward. I want to begin with this question. What does gospel mean? What does gospel mean? Now, I suspect that most people, including you who are students here at Midland, you would know or would have heard that the word gospel means good news. The Greek word euangelion, okay, euangelion, that's how it's written in Greek. And in English, that's how it's written. It means good news. Good news. And it was often associated with the arrival of good news to a kingdom, people coming with this great news of like victory or something. So good news is the basic meaning of the word gospel. But we also know that it speaks of a literary genre created by first century Christians, and that we call it then the Gospels. We pluralize it and speak about the Gospels, the four Gospels, or we might speak of the Gospels individually, the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Mark, Gospel of Luke, and the Gospel of John. Now, these are the four books that we are primarily interested in this course. These four books and Acts. Some people call Acts a fifth gospel, but it really isn't. Well, when we come to Acts, we talk about why some people call it that. Now, some people see it as an extension of Gospel of Luke. But these are the primarily the four books that we're talking about: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And when we come to look at them and trying to understand them, there are some basic things that we must start out with. These are not merely historical books or documents, as other historical books or documents are. This is not just telling you the history of some person. There's more to it than that. Even though we are suggesting and we understand that there are a lot of historical claims in the Gospels, they are not mere biographies as other biographies are, even though we know that we get a lot of biographical details about the main character of the Gospels, namely Jesus. And there's also biographical details about some of his followers, about his followers, like Peter, James, and John. And for instance, if you have a life application Bible and you go and you look at the biographies that are recorded in the life application Bible, you will see that they use a lot of the details of the Gospels to help with the biographies, especially of those people who followed Jesus. Some of them, that is like Peter and so on. And the Gospels are not mere miracle reports, as such might be. There's a whole big discussion regarding whether or not the Gospels were written from a document that captured, recorded the miracles of Jesus as a separate kind of a book. You know, these are not just mere miracle stories of Jesus, even though there are many of them in that. So, what are they? What are the Gospels? And this is where I want us to be very, very careful in us understanding what we are talking about when we speak of the Gospels. What are the Gospels? First of all, to go back to exactly what we said at first, Gospels are the good news of Jesus Christ. Now, I want us to move on and see how important it is for what we have just said. The Gospels are a unique mix of history or biography, literature, and theology. A unique mix of history and biography, literature, and theology. And if we were to ever minimize any of those three understandings of what the Gospels are, then we run the risk of misunderstanding the books themselves and the message of the books. So we want to keep these things in mind as we move forward. Now, a big question then is, why are there four Gospels? I don't know if you ever wondered about that. Why four? And here is what we're going to suggest. There are four Gospels because there are four different perspectives on the life of Jesus. They are different, but they are not contradictory. Now, three of those Gospels, they share many of the same details of Jesus' work. And we call those the synoptic gospels, namely Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the word synoptics mean seeing together. They are very much alike in many of the stories that are told. Okay? And they are actually very different from John's gospel. John's gospel stands out, very, very different from the other three. And the difference in John's gospel serves to pronounce the similarities between the synoptics. However, though the synoptics are similar, they are not the same because, as I said before, the Gospels are born out of different perspectives, on the part of the Gospel writers, and it's also associated with the people to whom the Gospel writers are speaking, who they are originally writing to, their original audiences. Their purposes are connected to their audiences. They want their audiences to understand who Jesus is, but these are different people. These are four different sets of people with their own unique set of circumstances. And so the gospel writers tell the stories of Jesus or the accounts of Jesus in ways that each audience can best appreciate, at least in the mind of the gospel writers. Okay? Different perspectives born out of their unique and original audiences and theological purposes. So we keep that in mind as we move forward. Now, that raises the issue of what we call the synoptic problem. What is the synoptic problem? Well, here is it stated very succinctly. If the synoptics are seen together, why are some of the accounts told differently, sometimes with different settings or details? For example, if you look at the parable of the talents in Matthew's gospel, I think it is, and compare it with a similar parable in Luke's gospel, the parable of minas, you see that it's obviously the same story, but the details are different. Or look at the story of the woman anointing Jesus with perfume. You know, they you look at the stories from the different gospels. I want you to go and you look at them, look them up and find them, and you will see that the stories don't all have the same details. You know, for instance, one of them tells us that the woman was Mary, another doesn't even tell us who she was. Or they tell us that the house where it was, and the others are not. The others tell as though the house in which the event took place took place in the home of a stranger, somebody who invited Jesus to dinner, a Pharisee named Simon. Others give the impression that it's a house of Mary and Martha and so on. Look at them and you see that the stories, though obviously similar, they have different details. Why are they like that? Same stories, apparently, or are they? But with different settings and details. And it's obviously not good enough to say that each evangelist is writing his own take on Jesus since there are so many similarities. In other words, some people just say, oh, the differences are because this is John's perspective and this is Mark's perspective, or well, the book here said John, it's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Okay, each of these are their perspectives, and they just run a rough shadow the details, it seems, and that's just not something that we are very comfortable. Okay, so that is a synoptic problem. The synoptic problem is trying to account for the similarities between the first three gospels, which at the same time show in many of those stories varying degrees of differences. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about this synoptic problem or the synoptic characteristics of the first three gospels. If you look at this chart, you will see that 76% of Mark's gospel in the purple, 76% of Mark's gospel makes up 41% of Luke and 46% of
So Mark is largely contained in Luke and Matthew. Okay? Now Luke has some material unique to him. 35% of Luke is material unique to him, while Matthew has 20% of material unique to them. And there's what we call a double tradition. That is material that is conversely seen in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. Okay? There's 10% of Mark that is made up from 18%, or 18% of Mark makes up 10% of Matthew. Matthew is a much larger book. Okay? How do we make sense of that? Mark and Luke share about 1%. 3% of Mark's gospel makes up about 1% of Luke's gospel. Okay? 3%, or we can find them in Matthew and Luke. The question is, how do we make sense of all of this? Okay? The triple tradition in the middle speaks of the things that are common to all three books. Unique to Mark is only 3% of Mark that's not found in any of the other synoptic gospels. So how do we make sense of this? So let's move to the next. There are two most prominent solutions to this. Is called the Markan priority. These are not the only solutions, but I'm going to put them as the two most prominent solutions today. One is suggesting that there are two sources from which the Gospels are written. One is the Gospel of Mark, and the second is a document called Q. Okay? Q is a document it is supposedly was first a document from oral tradition. Okay? That was compiled along with the Gospel of Mark to use as a foundation of Matthew and Luke. So look at that. You see, Matthew is made up of material largely from Mark, then some material from Q, and then there is a third source that is seen in Mark, which is in the green. Okay? Not certain exactly what that third source is, but the prominent two sources are Mark and Q. Q is from a German word, which means, I think, speech. I'll tell you by the end of the class. Okay? Now, this is a very prominent source, and up until the prominent theory, and up until the 1950s, this was a prominent theory behind how the synoptics came together. However, in the 1950s, scholars started to raise questions, and it was mooted that there is another theory that does not require Q. Nobody has ever found Q, by the way. This document of Jesus Saves. Okay? Nobody has ever found it. So here is one since the 1950s that has gained more traction and today has become more prominent. Okay, still not as prominent as the two source hypotheses, but this one says that there is a Markan priority without Q. No Q is necessary. And if you look at them, what it suggests is that Mark is the predominant document that makes up Matthew and large part of Luke. Okay? And then, very interestingly, it is suggested that Luke also borrows heavily from Matthew. If you look at some of the videos you can find on YouTube and so on, or read some of it, you see where they say that this theory accounts for much of Luke from seeing him borrowing from Matthew. Of course, these Writers are not just borrowing wholesale, even though we have some evidence of that, but they are writing the stories, telling the stories from their perspectives, and that's why you will see that there's obviously some differences as we go along. But these are the two prominent ideas behind the formation of the synoptic gospels. I would like you to look at this a little bit more, read on it, and maybe one of you might want to write a paper on the synoptic problem. That's fine. This is just to get you started, and you can move on. Okay, so let's move on from that. I mentioned before that the gospel writers each have different purposes and they're writing to a different audience. This will explain some of the differences that we definitely see. So, for instance, let's look at them. First of all, the Gospel of Matthew is written to Palestinian Jews. And the purpose is to show that Jesus is God's kingdom Messiah, both of the Jews and the entire world, and that people should believe in him. However, it is written predominantly to Palestinian Jews. How we know that? Well, one of the things that we notice in the Gospel of Matthew is the very Jewishness of the document. Matthew does not use the word God in his Gospel. He says kingdom of heaven and not the kingdom of God. Because to the Jew, to the good devout Jew, to use the name God was repugnant. It was blasphemy almost. And so the best explanation is that Matthew is taking, for instance, the very miracles about the kingdom, and instead of saying kingdom of God, he's saying kingdom of heaven, because he is writing to Jews, Palestinian Jews. The other thing that we notice about it, for instance, is that the book seems to be patterned off the Decalogue, 5 books of Moses, in much of what he is doing. And he even sets up Jesus as a new Moses or the greater Moses. When Jesus goes on the Sermon on the Mount, writers will tell you that that is a euphemistic way of saying that Jesus went up on an elevated place. There was no mountains in Jerusalem like that, okay? But he went on an elevated place, and the writer speaks of the mountain to speak of Jesus giving the new kind of law, replacing Moses. That's Matthew's gospel, writing to Palestinian Jews. Okay, a lot of extensive quotations from the Old Testament. Mark's gospel, however, is written to Roman Jews and Gentiles, both Jews and Gentiles. And we know that he's writing to Romans, for instance, when we look in Matthew 15, we're talking of Simon of Cyrene. He identifies Simon as the one who is the father of Alexander and Rufus. We learn from Romans 16 that maybe it was Alexander or maybe it was Rufus who was a member of the church in Rome, and Paul knew both him and his mother. And Paul would have known Simon of Cyrene, Simon called Niger. We see that from Acts chapter 13, where he's one of the men who sent Paul out on his mission, first missionary journey, along with Barnabas. Okay, that time he was called Saul. Saul and Barnabas went out the first missionary journey. And Simon of Niger, who the church history and tradition have told us is the same person called Simon of Cyrene, who got converted after he was forced to help Jesus to carry the cross on the day of crucifixion. He was the one who, tradition tells us, he went to Rome, a missionary to Rome, and there his family was established. And Paul came to know them, and Paul knew both Simon's wife and his children. So we see that he speaks of Simon as a father of Alexander and Rufus in a way as though his audience knows who he's talking about. And that is Rome. They are in Rome. Luke is written to Gentiles, a very Gentile oriented gospel. It is written to Theophilus, a very Greek name, Gentile name. We're not certain if Theophilus is an actual person or if it's a figurative way of speaking that is anybody who's a lover of God. The word Theophilus means one who loves God. But Luke has an affinity for Gentiles and outcasts, women, okay? People whom the Jews saw as second class at best. These are the people that Luke have in mind when he's writing the story of Jesus. He wants them to understand that Jesus has come. Okay? And he also interprets the Jewish words and put them in Greek and so on. That is all that. While John's gospel, not partly synoptic, John's gospel is written to Greeks, Greeks in Asia Minor, very educated Greeks, very high thinking Greeks. And we learn that from the way in which John writes. And for instance, he uses Greek concepts like the logos, writing to his audience. And he wants them to know that Jesus is God himself, who has come as both God and man to die for mankind. So we call all the gospel writers evangelists. So we call Matthew an evangelist, Mark an evangelist, Luke and John are also evangelists. Okay? We call them that because they want people to come to Jesus to believe. Now, let's move to the world of the New Testament. You cannot understand the New Testament well until you come to understand the world in which the New Testament. Here is a book that you should be able to find in your library. It's called New Testament History by F. F. Bruce. It's one of the best resources on the subject. And I want you to go and become familiar with this book. And if you can't find this book there, then you can't buy it. If you can't buy it, you can check any New Testament survey or introduction, which will help you. But this will give you tremendous amount of information, great information on the world of the New Testament. So I can't tell you everything here, but I can start giving you an overview as we move forward about this world of the New Testament. Okay? In understanding the New Testament, we ought to connect its writings with the world in which that should be they originated. Okay? The world in which they originated. If we do not do that, then we are going to be in problem. In understanding the New Testament, we ought to connect its writings with the world in which they originate. I think that is common sense. If you don't understand the world in which the New Testament documents were written, you are not going to understand it properly. It's like listening in on someone's telephone conversation. Some of it is going to make sense. But if you do not know the history of the people or the person on the other side of who the other person is or know their circumstances, some of it is not going to make sense to you. You only get a better understanding when you come to hear a lot more, understand a lot more of their true reality. So, for instance, we need to understand the socio-political realities of the Greco-Roman world, okay? And the Greco-Roman domination of Palestine or Jerusalem or the land of the Jews. What do I mean by that? There are a number of things that we need to talk about, like Hellenization, how in 330 BC, how Alexander the Great conquered the known world, the whole known world of the day, including what we know as Israel. Okay, and he forced the Greek Grecian way of life onto the people he conquered. Now, there's a lot of negatives about that, but there are some benefits, for instance, also. So, one of the things that he did, he was a very smart man. He understood that in dominating people, you couldn't force people to love you. But if you made yourself likable and if you made your culture, the culture you're forcing on people, if you made it likable, then in time people will come to start to accept it. And so, for instance, one of the things that he did is that he started to make Greek plays popular. Greek theater became popular. Remember, there wasn't much of that tradition among the Jews, for instance. He started to make those very popular. He made Greek learning popular, put in libraries about the place. He wrote the scriptures in the language, translated the scriptures into Greek. That's how we got the Septuagint. And that was a master move because what he was doing is saying to the people that even though I've conquered you, your religious tradition is still important. So he put that in the language of Greek. Okay, they were Hebrew speakers. And that by the time of Jesus, the Old Testament was most popular in Greek. We call it the Septuagint. Even though the more the more pietistic Jews insisted on what we call the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text. Okay? But this is what Hellenization, and there's so much more. You can read a lot more about Hellenization from Bruce's book, New Testament History. Okay? But apart from the Greeks, by the time of Jesus, the place was conquered by the Romans. And the great Roman experiment at the time was called the Pax Romana, Pax Romana, the Peace of Rome. And what that means, that's P-E-A-C, Peace of Rome. Romans believed that the only way they could stay in power was to keep the peace and enforce peace as much as they could. They knew that the Jews, for instance, hated them, and the Jews were prone to rebellion. So the Romans did all kinds of things to ensure that they put down rebellion very quickly to keep peace in Rome. So they fixed the roads. They had a large police force that moved up by very quickly. They put down rebellions very brutally, crucifixions and so on. But in order for them to send people across the empire very quickly to do these things, they had to be able to move those people, not just by the roads, but they had to pay for it. And the way they paid for that was through heavy taxation, very heavy taxation. And one of the ways in which they collected taxes from the people was they had a group of conquered people that we know in the New Testament as the publicans or the tax collectors, who were seen as sellouts. A part of Pax Romana, they supported the taxation system of the Romans, and then in order for them to make their living, they would overtax their people. For instance, if Rome said you are supposed to bring in X amount of money from each person based on their earnings, they would charge the person X plus 1 or X plus 2 and then keep the plus 2 for themselves. Tax collectors became very wealthy off the backs of their brothers and sisters in Jerusalem or in Israel, and they were not very popular. We have Zacchaeus and we have Levi or Matthew as very unpopular people, okay, in the New Testament. Popular among the Jews. So we have that as a part of Pax Romana. Colonization, Romans are colonizing the Jews and all the conquered world, and we just spoke about some of that in the Pax Romana. But apart from that, for instance, when they colonized, they told you where you could go, when you could do it. They told you even what festivals you could observe, and they gave them even religious freedom. Okay, we're going to talk about that a little bit later again. as long as you follow their rules. And there's a lot of social hierarchies that came along with the Romans, and it's brought the types of poverty of the day. So the social hierarchies were largely created by those who supported the rulers. They became landowners and they became the moneyed people, okay? And everybody else in the land were next to poverty. Basically, right? Poverty was widespread, widespread. Now, because of this colonization and the Hellenization and the Pax Romana and the widespread poverty and taxation of the people, the Jewish religious sects or religious parties, they had sprung up from maybe 150 years before Jesus. They started to come up. And there are three major ones, two of which we see in the New Testament, and the other, we only have hints of them. We don't see them openly in the Testament. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. Bruce, again, gives some good history on these. I want you to go and check it out, okay? The history of the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. But the Pharisees were the fundamentalist kinds of religious people. They held to the Old Testament, what we call it, or the Jewish Bible as they saw it. Okay, the 39 books of the Jewish Bible they held to very tenaciously, and they took it literally. Okay, and then the Sadducees were around since the Maccabean revolt, and what they were is that they were a political party that first of all supported the ruling class. At first, it was the Maccabees when they overthrew a man called Antiochus Epiphanes from the Syrian madman who had conquered the people of Palestine. Okay, the Maccabees had conquered him, and in order to support themselves in power, they created a new religious group called the Sadducees. And they empowered the Sadducees um, with special favors. I'll just put it that way. They became wealthy landowners, and they were also given the right of the high priesthood in Israel. From the teachings of Moses, the high priesthood should have passed through Aaron's line, tribe of Levi. However, when the Maccabees ended after the Maccabean revolt and the Sadducees came up, that was by political appointment, no longer necessarily having to do with the person being in the tribe of Levi. Now, the Sadducees were also different from the Pharisees, and the Sadducees only believed in the 5 books of Moses, not the rest of the Jewish Bible. They rejected any aspect of the supernatural, and they rejected any aspect of angels, you know, but they were the most powerful religious group in the country at the time of Jesus. There were 71 members of the Sanhedrin, and Rome organized it, and over the years had become organized that 36 were Sadducees and 35 were Pharisees. In the likely event, and I say likely because they were so divided, that almost anything dispute that came up between them, they would vote, and they need a vote. All the Pharisees would vote together, all the Sadducees would vote. And to give the Sadducees the edge, they had one person extra. Okay? One person extra. We see much of the division between the Pharisees and the Sadducees in the trial of Paul in Jerusalem in about Acts 22 or 23 thereabouts. When Paul says, I am on trial because of my belief in the resurrection. And that split the Sanhedrin because he spoke the words of the Pharisees deliberately and threw this whole chamber into uproar because the Sadducees did not. Okay. Then there are the Essenes. The Essenes were the separatist sect who pulled away to what we know as a Qumran community. They were very devout into a lot of washing, and they wore full white, we are told by history, and they kept themselves to themselves. They did not mix in the population very much. And it is oftentimes argued that John himself was once a member of the Essene community. But we don't know about them here in the New Testament itself. Now, there are also other political sects. For instance, you have the Herodians. The Herodians were a set of Jews who supported the Herods. The Herods were vast leaders or quasi leaders set up by Rome as proxy leaders who had a measure of autonomy, but they couldn't act out Rome's backing, and the Herodians ruled in as kings in Palestine, given special favors to support Rome. Okay, so they were pro-Rome Herodians. And they were not particularly religious, even though they came from the Jews. Right? And then you had the Zealots, who were the very opposite. These were knife men who carried around a dagger called the Sicarii. Sicarii men they were, and what they were paid assassins. They were assassins who were trained to assassinate, to kill any Roman officials or those who supported the Romans. Okay? The most famous zealot we have in the New Testament is a man called Simon the Zealot, a knife man who came to Jesus. Now, the truth is that all of this brought a lot of political religious realities to the people that we oftentimes overlook when we come to talk about the New Testament. For instance, the politics of the day, Roman-led politics of the day, said that the people were free to practice their religion, except when Rome said no. And a part of that is that there was an emperor worship cult in Rome that saw Caesar as God. And at a particular time, Caesar had to be obeyed as God. Jews, the pious Jews, refused to do so. And sometimes that brought them into problems. Okay? We need to understand. Now, there's something else. There's also what we call the Greek and Near Eastern religious cults. I mentioned the emperor worship a while ago. A lot of Greek mythology in the New Testament. When you go to Acts 17, for instance, Paul in Athens, you will see references there to the different gods that they were worshiping. You see Paul going on his journeys to Rome on the ship, and he was shipwrecked. Unless you understand the Greek mythology there, some of the references are going to fly away ahead. Much of that is there. And then there are the Egyptian mystery religions that are also prominent in the day. So, for instance, you're not going to understand John 9, I am the light of the world, until you understand the Isis and Orsis cults that sometimes the people came into contact with. Okay? All right? The Isis was said to have provided light of the world. Here it is that Jesus says, I'm the light of the world. He's speaking the language that some people would have understood. But more so, John reflects on that because the people of Asia Minor, to whom he wrote, understood these philosophies and these religious ideas too. So all of this becomes extremely important. I'm saying again, friends, go to a book like Bruce and read as much of this. Okay? Lastly, let me just mention this and then we move on. That when we come to the New Testament too, we must understand some of the education realities. The Jews were better educated than most because they were a people of the book, meaning the Jewish Bible, and that God had communicated them in writings. They had a tradition of teaching especially boys how to read and write. By the time they were age 12 or 13, the average Jewish boy already knew most of the Hebrew Bible and he could read. Girls were not usually educated, even though we have some evidence that some parents educated their daughters. The Greeks had a very high understanding of education because of the Greek fascination with learning. So when you get into the Greek world itself, like of Asia Minor and so on, we're dealing with populations that are more educated than normal. Romans were not necessarily educated unless you were a part of the upper crust of society. Okay, most Romans did not need to read or write, and Gentiles themselves were not necessarily educated. Okay, not necessarily educated in terms of formal education. That is why much of the New Testament, it is argued, first existed in the form of what we call rhetoric devices, or there were oral speeches at first, given in that way, and then they were later on recorded. That's what some people believe. Now, these are all important ideas. Let me mention one other thing. Let's jump up back to the social hierarchies in the time of the New Testament. This is an extremely important idea. I think that we overlook that a big part of the social hierarchy of the New Testament is how the society was ordered. The word is called hostafim, okay, which means the household codes, where the man was at the top, a woman was below him, children were below the woman, the slaves were at the absolute top. Okay? Now, very often we think that this comes from Genesis, but there is no such reference in Genesis to slaves being a part of a divine order. That's the first clue that it's not coming from Genesis. Well, maybe it's a mixture of Genesis and something else, many people think, right? I think that there's evidence there that suggests that the New Testament social order came forth from the teachings of a man called Aristotle. Aristotle wrote 300 years before Christ that the man reigned absolutely supreme, okay? And that he answered to no one. His wife was made to serve his needs, and his children served parents. And the slaves were absolutely made to serve the master as we move forward. Now, Aristotle actually believed that it was in the man's best interest to treat these people well. Because in treating these people well, you saw to the good running of society. However, by the time of the first century, Aristotle's teachings had been taken to, go in a different direction from what he meant. So the man still reigned supreme, and he had such supreme authority. So the man in the Greco-Roman world had such supreme authority over his family that he could do with his family as he pleased. They were his property. Okay? And so, for instance, what you're going to find in the writings in the New Testament era, not New Testament writings itself, times in the era, you'll find writings that will suggest that the man could kill his wife if she became objectionable to him, and he could kill his children, and he could kill his slaves. They were his absolute property. Now, I want you to keep that in mind when you read the Gospels, and you'll start to see that even though the Jews didn't have such an extreme understanding, you will see that in the Jewish setup also, women were seen as second classes. And children were to obey their parents, right? We see that coming from the Old Testament, right? Coming up from Deuteronomy. So we see that clearly. However, when you come to the when you come to the books of the epistles, for instance, when you come to read about women and the relationships between men and women, keep in mind that Paul is more reflecting on the Aristotelian order of society and less on the Genesis account. Even though he brings into some understandings of the Old Testament to help to bolster his art. Very important to remember that. Okay? He's responding more to the Greco-Roman argument about the way society is ordered than he's in the Old Testament. So I want to then go into just to tell you some things. This is where quickly this is brought apart. When you're reading the Gospels, then don't try to harmonize the stories in some chronological order. If you try to organize them in chronological order, you are going to distort the intention of it. Right? The writers are not tied to a strict chronology, but instead use stories to carry forward their purposes. Note, for instance, that John has the cleansing of the temple near the start of Jesus' ministry, while the synoptics have it at the end. Some people said that Jesus cleansed the temple twice. But if you understand that the writers are not writing chronologically, then there's no need to force that. Right? But reading the Gospels, keep the author's purposes in mind. You looked at that already. Every story is used to carry the purpose of the writer. Every story. If you look at Luke's Gospel, for instance, you're going to see every story in the Gospel of Luke after chapter 4. Up to chapter 4, it builds this idea that Jesus has come for the poor. And every story after chapter 4 is to be understood in light of Jesus' statement about his intention for coming, bringing good news for the poor. Every story fulfills Luke's purpose of seeing Jesus as the Messiah to the outcast. Read it, and all the other gospel writers are like that too. See how the stories support their purpose. There are no accidental stories or details in the Gospels. This is now coming to the idea of the Gospels as literature. The Gospel writers are skillful writers. They are keeping the things there. Okay, and so they're writing everything there deliberately. So ask yourself, how does the story or the details carry along the author's purpose? Right? For example, I want you to go to Mark 6 and look at this idea of green grass. Why does Mark say that the grass was green? The story of the feeding of the 5,000 is one of the few stories that is found in all four Gospels. Mark's Gospel is the only Gospel that says that the grass is green. Is that an accidental detail or is there a purpose to it? Or look at Luke 5, 17 to 26, which is the healing of the paralytic man who was let on through the roof. Again, this story is found in three of the Gospels, not four, it's not in John. In three of the Gospels and Synoptics. And in the Synoptics, Luke is the only one that doesn't mention the crowd on the outside. The crowd is on the inside. Why is that so? Look if you can look at those examples. Try to look at those examples, what we can find out there. When reading the Gospels, keep author's sociocultural realities in mind. We spoke about some of this just a while ago. I just want you to remember them. Jews' history of being dominated, the religious political sects that sprang up because of that domination. Jewish particularism and its hatred of foreigners, for instance, and Jewish patriarchy and its view of women. We mentioned some of those things. Keep those things in mind when reading the Gospels, because that will help you to make sense. When reading the Gospels, keep the literary world of the first century in mind. What I'm talking about. The use of hyperbole, for instance. The idea that the exaggeration prepared. Let me click on one and show you. For instance, a hyperbole here is the use of extreme exaggeration to capture attention and to make a point. Okay, so here the camel going through the eye of a needle. It's not to be taken literally. The context will make its meaning clear. That's hyperbole, right? Don't take hyperbole um, literally. And there are many other uses. You know, Jesus says, they ask Jesus, how many times should I forgive somebody? Jesus is 70 times 7, or did he say 77 times, or did he say 7 times in one day? All of that is hyperbole to prove a point. And there are other examples like that. Okay, when reading the Gospels, okay, the use of chiasmus and repetitions for emphasis. So these are these technical devices, writing devices, you know. So for instance, um, no, I went back to the wrong thing. So this is a chiasmus. What he's talking about here is the idea, it's a literary device in which words or concepts are repeated in reverse order. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, whoever humbles himself will be exalted. And the main point is humility captured in the center. Okay? There are many things like that. The other writing devices, I thought I would show you this one. Sometimes it's very simple, other times it's complex with emphasis on the thought captured in the middle. Okay? Some of the Psalms are chiasmus themselves, like Psalm 1, for instance. Okay? You have to go to the middle of the Psalm to see what's repeated, what is the idea that is, like that. And then the other thing we want to look at as we move forward, very big important part of the Gospels is what we call the parables. Okay, definition of parables. Where parables related to the Greek word parabola, which means to throw or place alongside. A parable, therefore, is something placed alongside something else for the purposes of comparison. So says Henry Verkler in his book in 1981. At its simplest, according to C.H. Dodd, a parable is a metaphor or symbol drawn from nature or common life, arresting the hearts of by its vividness or strangeness, and leaving the mind in sufficient doubt about the precise application to arouse it into active thought. In other words, Jesus, in using his parables, using simple stories usually that people can relate to, but he uses it in such a way that it will leave some of the hearers baffled, some of them angry, leave them all going a place to think. So, for instance, in the parable of the prodigal son, the religious leaders will know that he's speaking negatively about it. Okay? And this is going to leave them angry. Unless they are discerning, they aren't going to see that he's being very negative about them. At the same time, the sinners are understanding him saying things that are praiseworthy of them, or at least of God to them, and they are loving it. But very often, the parables are said in a way just to keep people off kilter a little bit, having them to think. Some special characteristics of the parables, in addition to the features mentioned above, other characteristics have been its suspense. Sometimes the parables wait until the very end, until the main point comes, like in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Okay? The main point comes towards the end. The foreigner, namely the Samaritan, was the one who was kind to the Jewish man who was beaten on the ground when everybody think that he was going to kill him. No. Okay? If you look at all the parables of Jesus, the story parables of Jesus, simple plot conflicts, it will be very easy to follow. Heightened contrast, as I mentioned before, the suspense heightened contrast come. Exaggeration for effect. You know, a man will leave 99 sheep to go and seek out one. I don't know if people actually do that, but the point is made. And usually there are three major characters or groups of characters in a story, okay, or to a story, I should say, in a story, but to a story. You're going to see that there is two audiences that are being addressed, usually a religious and a non-religious audience. The third is usually the storyteller, who is Jesus himself, who's representing God. And as I mentioned, there are unexpected turns and twists in the parables. So read the parables carefully. Purpose of parables, the intention of parables, the parabolic teaching is given by our Lord Jesus in Matthew 13, 9 to 15, and Mark 4, 10 to 12, and Luke 8, 8 to 10. And what are they? They are used as instruments of revelation to those who have ears to hear. But guess what? They are also used to hide truth from those who are unresponsive. And so it aided in them hardening their hearts as they rebel. I wonder where you fall in this. When interpreting parables, here are some clues. Understand the cultural context in which the parable is told. Determine the central truth of the parable that the parable is intended to teach. Usually its connection with the gospel's purpose. And we just read with the purpose in mind, and it should come out easily. Determine how much the parable is interpreted by the Lord himself. Example, in Luke 8:11, he will tell you the meaning of the parable sometimes, and if he tells you the meaning, that is the meaning. Sometimes the context gives you clues concerning the parable's meaning. Look at that. So, for instance, and this is not the exact meaning of the parable, but in the parable of the prodigal son, okay, knowing a little bit about the context of the day, namely how properties were divided among sons, two to one, the older son will get two parts, the younger son will get one part. Then the properties were not divided until after the father's death. Those kinds of things will help you to get an understanding, to build tension in the parable as you go forward. And the big question is, what does it teach about Christ and his kingdom? So we finally come to the conclusion of this lecture. When we read and arrive at hasty conclusions, that is reading the gospel, because of what we see on the surface of the gospels, we are likely to preach error from them, or we likely to draw error from them. Preach or teach or draw error from them. The fact that God seems to have blessed our bad preaching and our bad teaching with positive results is more a testimony to his goodness than to our faithfulness. And that's one of the reasons why you are here learning about the Gospels, is that you will be faithful to God's words. Okay? So, as God's faithful servants, we must rightly divide the word of truth. Second Timothy. This has been a lot. I hope that you, if you need to, you could stop it at some time, stop the record at some time, and look back at it and so on, and to burden yourself with going all the way through. Okay? But I hope it was instructive. I have some final two slides for you. These are not the lecture themselves, but these are to help you. Here are some resources you check out. I already told you about New Testament history by F.F. Bruce. I also mentioned Any Good New Testament survey, focusing especially on the Gospels that should be in the Acts. All right, go and check them. You have a lot of them in the library. Gramake, Gondry, Tenney, Carson, any New Testament survey, they can help. And there are some YouTube videos I want you to check out. David Da Silva has an excellent resource on the New Testament introduction. Okay, but he also has a full series of lectures on background to the New Testament, and you can find them on YouTube. They are long videos, like an hour each, about 8 videos, I think, 6 or 8. You can check it out. They are long, but they are excellent. I ask you, I suggest that throughout the semester that you go through that one by one. Okay? There's a small video, one take on a synoptic problem and how we can solve it. You can look that. And then what has become one of my absolute favorite resources is the Bible Project. Okay? Small videos, short videos. And I want you to look at the Bible Project videos on YouTube if you haven't done so before. Start looking at them, okay? And those are the links that I want you to look at. The first one is a series to all the New Testament books. I want you to pay special attention to Gospels and Acts. And then you also have one on the gospel. Excellent resource on the gospel. Very short videos. Those are Bible Project videos are between 5 and 8 or 9 minutes. So you can check. All right. Finally, to help you along, I want to give you some questions. According to the Bible Project, the gospel stories weave Old Testament ideas into their accounts about Jesus to speak of his identity. Okay? So the question is, or the instruction is, see if you can identify which Old Testament images are weaved into the accounts of Jesus walking on the water and him calming the storm. When you do, I want you to comment next time we see each other. How did this impact on you? Okay? Old Testament stories are actually behind or being alluded to in these stories of Jesus. And I want you to explain this for me. In your mind, does the idea that the gospel writers told some of the stories of Jesus with different details affect you? Okay? I want you to think about that and explain. Okay? The next time we come together. All right. That's enough for me. That's a whole mouthful for me. A whole long time, a long video for the first lecture. I'm going to end now. If you have any questions, please you give me a WhatsApp message or call. Okay, I'll be out of Jamaica as of Wednesday until Monday. I'm back on Monday. But I want you to follow through on this. And if you need to send me a WhatsApp message, send. All right? Blessings. Thank you.